Amen. The last time I presented was at the Oceania camp meeting 2 weeks ago now. I'm not sure if people are aware of the day. What date is it today? It's October 3, and what does that mean? October 3, 2018 was the day that Time was presented in Arkansas. So it's the 2-year anniversary of the Midnight Cry message in the United States. And I just wanted to mention, it's not something profound or some great methodology, but we did find it fascinating at the time. It was presented October 3 in Arkansas. 10 days later, where was it presented? I'm going to be looking at the chat a lot today, so please feel free to comment. October 3 in Arkansas. October 10 in France. Someone messaged me privately. Correct. October 3, Arkansas. October 13, France. And we understood at the time that the Midnight Cry message had a footwear and a footwear. October 3, it had a foot on the earth, and October 13, it had a foot on the sea, land and sea. Ellen White speaks about the message having 1 foot on the sea and 1 foot on the land. So it went from the United States, which is the land, to France, which is the sea. And where was the third place that the Midnight Cry message was shared? United States, October 3, France, October 13, December 2018, where was the message shared? The third location. Some of you should know this well. Brother Graham, Island of the Seas. Island of the Seas ministry, which is what location? Following the chat. Fiji. Someone answered privately. So it went from the land to the sea to the islands of the sea, was the 3 steps that the Midnight Cry message took in 2018. October 3, 2 years ago, was the United States. 10 days later, France. A number of weeks later, Fiji, which is, as we saw 2 weeks ago, is led by the Islands of the Sea ministry. And we saw at the time that that was a prophetic fulfillment. It was another stamp on the Midnight Cry message. So I just wanted to note that, considering the interaction we had 2 weeks ago with the Islands of the Sea ministry, and considering the time frame that we're in. So 2 years ago, that message was given. In some ways it feels like 20 years ago, in some ways it feels like 2 weeks. From the first 3 main givings of that message in October, November and December, through 2019, it went worldwide. And voice after voice joined that cry, and it really swelled. As country after country and individual after individual joined their voice to that message. Since then, we have traced that history with the end of ancient Israel, seeing the triumphal entry through the upper room, through the separation, through the pain of Gethsemane, and through the cross, which we still, prophetically, still don't understand completely, through November 9. And we entered into a new dispensation. We're in the dispensation of Jacob's time of trouble. Does anyone feel like we're not in Jacob's time of trouble? I think that is one subject we're all in concord with. It is a time of trouble. So that message that was given 2 years ago, it swelled and was taught throughout the world in 2019. It really came to a conclusion at the German International Camp meeting in August and September of last year. The final touches were put on that message with World War I, the 𝗃𝗏𝗏𝗿𝗃𝗃𝗄𝗏, World War I, completing our understanding of World War III, and the message of Eden to Eden. That soon became also the focal point of the shaking. The division that had been growing over some time came into the open. And God saw fit to direct us, now that the Midnight Cry message had reached a completion. God directed us back to reform lines, the lines of the beginning and end of ancient Israel and the beginning and end of modern Israel. And right when we came into the most critical parts of the history of the priests, these two back-to-back testing time periods, God saw fit to anchor us in those original reform lines. And if you are familiar with the Canadian Zoom camp meeting of a little while ago, a couple of months ago perhaps, that is what we tried to remind people of. We hold on to those cords, and God gave us those cords at the exact same point as the first of two shakings came into the open. Those are the cords that were particularly to anchor us. The Midnight Cry message and those reform lines given in 1989. So from August and September of last year, when the Midnight Cry message came to some type of completion, through till about April and May of this year, about 6-7 months, we focused on the end of ancient Israel. And it is the pattern that we see behind us. The model that takes us from 4 BC to 100 AD. And then the three groups of people called in that time period. 2 for the Jewish nation, and then finally at 34 AD, which is here, to the Gentiles. So through the history of that, particularly that first shaking, and also into the second, from August, September through around April, May, we focused on the end of ancient Israel, and we largely established that reform line. I'm not saying there isn't still additions to be made, but that reform line became very well established. And if we believe that in that reform line, it is a cord that would take us over both shaking time periods. From about April, May, the end of the school in Portugal, through to now, so that's about 6 months again, we have been focusing on the beginning of modern Israel, Millerite history. And you'll notice that we haven't actually gotten that far. It's only a few weeks since we actually even laid out a structure. And I would suggest one of the reasons for that, one of the characteristics of this time that makes it so difficult to be able to lay out this history, is a result of the pandemic. We are starting to have some camp meetings over Zoom, but what we haven't been able to do is have schools. And it's at schools that the message really becomes, if you picture it like bread dough, it gets stretched, it gets folded, it gets wrestled with and kneaded. Not just by the person up the front, but by the students who are participating. It becomes an open discussion, not just with the students there, but by people following online who then message and ask questions and add their thoughts. One of the reasons Acts 27 is such a solid study is because it had 3 months at the school in Brazil early last year where we wrestled with Acts 27. We haven't been able to do that with Millerite history. And it's the absence of having schools in this movement that has impeded the rapid growth of this message and the ability of many people to feel established in that reform line. But we have been going over it Sabbath after Sabbath. So we are missing schools. So I wanted just to give us a brief verbal overview of the last 2 years. From October 3, 3 main camp meetings, 3 main presentations in Arkansas, land, France, sea, Fiji, islands of the sea. Then it spread through 2019, came to a conclusion in the German International Camp Meeting by September last year. Then God gave us back the reform lines. They are particularly the cords that were going to hold us through the epicenter of 2 crises facing this movement. We faced the first, that split in the upper room when Judas left, then through Gethsemane and the cross, November 9, still properly to be understood, then entering into the wilderness time period, the 40 days, on 2 different models of the end of ancient Israel, the 40 days of the wilderness and the 40 days of the disciples. And you can take that and see that in other 40-day time periods. 40 days of Goliath claiming to have defeated this movement. I won't go into that any further. But that 40 days has now reached a conclusion, and we are now in the upper room time period. We've entered into a new dispensation from November 9 last year, and we have been through that time period needing to understand concretely the beginning and end of ancient Israel, more commonly known as the line of Moses and the line of Christ, and the beginning and end of modern Israel, more commonly known as the line of the Millerites and the line of the 144,000. We've been impeded in the growth of that message by the absence of schools. I wouldn't say so much camp meetings. Camp meetings are the more public presentation of what is generally discovered and dug out through schools and private studies. And we are missing that. But we also recognize that this is the dispensation where the focus of our work is also particularly organization. And that also requires more time than it ever has before. So we have been meaning over the last 5 months from May to study Millerite history together. And we've gone on what might seem quite a lot of tangents. We started that study and realized that we needed to also lay a couple of other things in place. First of all, why did Christ not come in Millerite history? We would say because it's a history of failure. Then we need to understand, why is it a history of failure? We would say they went back into the Laodicean condition. We wanted to understand what that meant. Why is this failure? Why is that the Laodicean condition? So we went back to here and we saw the Apis bull. And we saw what this Apis bull was and represented. And then we were able to trace it and see why, not why the end of ancient Israel was failure because it was success, but we see why ancient Israel, why the Jewish nation fell away. It's a history of success, but not for the Jewish nation. So we wanted to see what this Laodicean condition was, and how it's carried through in such a way, not that our history is a history of failure, but why for the Adventist institution it is a history of failure. Why they fail where this movement succeeds. And what we recognised was that it was a returning to idolatry. The Apis bull, the idolatry of the pagan nations. The Laodicean condition, the idolatry of apostate Protestantism. So all that we've studied in this history that has seemed to be taking us away from Millerite history has been necessary to understand Millerite history. Now we know why they're a history of failure. They went back to apostate Protestant idolatry. What was that idolatry? We began to look at conspiracy theories, at nationalism, at apostate Protestant thinking as it developed from 1798 particularly, and then through all of that history, even addressing the conservative Protestant response to the League of Nations in 1919, the threat of globalism that they held to. And now we find that as Israel, as the Jewish nation, held on to that idolatry from pagan nations, today Adventism has held on to the idolatry of apostate Protestantism. The Jewish nation would never have admitted to it. Adventism never admits to it. And you see that ancient Israel would say, we look out at the wickedness of Rome. We're in opposition to Egypt and to Babylon and to Rome. We can see that they don't follow God. We can see that they need to be destroyed. They're in idolatry. They can't see how they've imbibed the exact same thinking. Adventism today, they look out at the world. If I can give one example, they look out at the Supreme Court, and what does every good conservative, socially conservative Adventist think when they look at the Supreme Court? It's horror. Why? Why do conservative Adventists fear the Supreme Court? Why are they horrified by the Supreme Court? What's the issue they have with it? It's Catholic. So many members of the Supreme Court are Catholic. So a good socially conservative Adventist feels threatened by the Supreme Court because the Supreme Court is Catholic, and they believe that this Catholic Supreme Court, because they're afraid of Catholicism, who elected those Catholic Supreme Court justices? It wasn't a Catholic president, it was not a Catholic Congress. Protestants elected those Catholic Supreme Court justices. But Adventists look at those Supreme Court judges and they're afraid. Why? Because sometime in the distant future, those Catholic Supreme Court justices might institute a Sunday law. So they're afraid because they see Catholic Supreme Court justices, but in real life, how do they feel about that Supreme Court? Those Catholic Supreme Court justices are socially conservative, Republican-leaning, Republican mentality judges. And those exact same justices are ruling on what issues? Abortion. How does Adventism feel about that? Now they agree with those justices. Gay marriage. How does Adventism feel about that? Now that they agree with those justices. LGBTQ rights. Now where do they stand? They agree with those same justices. The way those justices define religious liberty. We discussed a few weeks ago the 2014 Hobby Lobby decision where the Supreme Court ruled in favour of a company that did not want to give health care that it did not agree with to its employees. So a company that is a family business that is owned by a religious family wanted to control what health care they could give to their employees based on their religious beliefs. And the Supreme Court decided in favour of that company. Ruth Bader Ginsburg was a dissenting voice in that Supreme Court case, and she spoke out strongly against that Supreme Court case. We discussed that a number of weeks ago. But those Catholic, socially conservative justices ruled in favour of this religious family that owned the Hobby Lobby business. How did Adventism respond to the Hobby Lobby court case? The Seventh-day Adventist Church in North America released an official statement. This is written July 1st, 2014 in Adventism Today. The Seventh-day Adventist Church in North America released an official statement yesterday saying that it was encouraged by the decision announced this week by the Supreme Court of the United States in the Hobby Lobby case. But there were Adventists who expressed reservations and concerns about the same decision. There are Levites. The denomination's official statement gave emphasis to the fact that the decision reaffirmed the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which safeguards the broad religious liberty protections available to all people of faith. One person commented and said, "Usually religious rights are defined in terms of being protected from the government restricting one from doing something that you feel God wants you to do. It seems to have moved that the definition of religious rights has moved to a new thing altogether, when it's about a right to exercise authority or to dictate to employees your religious belief." An example of the hypocrisy of this ruling, it's in those justices on the Supreme Court are Catholic and Protestant, largely Catholic. So if an employee decides they're not going to provide birth control services in the health care to their workers, then the employee, it's the religious right of the employee to withhold that birth control funding. But then what happens if you're a Jehovah's Witness? What happens if you're the employee and you're a Jehovah's Witness and you don't believe in blood transfusions? And now you own a company, you're a Jehovah's Witness, and you don't want to provide health care to your employees that would supply them with blood transfusions. What the Supreme Court did is in that ruling they put in a special clause that said this does not apply to blood transfusions. Why? There is no good reason except they're not Jehovah's Witnesses and their personal bias is against birth control and for blood transfusions. So this isn't a decision of belief or of principle, it's about the right to force the religious beliefs of an employer onto an employee in a secular environment. I just want us to see the danger that Adventism is in. It's just a revision. That while they are afraid that somewhere down the track they're going to disagree with these Catholic, conservative Supreme Court justices, including the one currently being elected, in the present day, they agree with the worldview and the decisions of that same faction because they are in apostate Protestant idolatry, and apostate Protestants elected that Supreme Court. So all of that we did because we wanted to go back to Millerite history and understand why they failed. And we've had to make some applications and some compare and contrast to do that. Go back to other reform lines. So it isn't my purpose today to go back to Millerite history. We're not going to do that in today's study, perhaps not in next week's study either. What I'd like to do is actually to address some frequently occurring questions that people have been asking, especially in the last couple of months. These questions have been coming up so frequently, I thought best to address them in a study or a couple of studies, rather than just go back onto Millerite history. So we are delaying again our study of Millerite history. So it's more of a Q&A, but with the questions already provided. And because of that, I would also encourage people to write on the chat your thoughts, added perspectives of the questions, or answers to the questions. So I am encouraging chat participation. Many of the questions that people have been asking are reasonable questions, questions I've had myself. They're honest-hearted questions. There's nothing wrong with asking questions or having questions, but not all the questions are. There's a mixture. Some are asked in good faith, some are not. One that was not asked in good faith. Example, someone asked the question, how is the coming of Cambridge Analytica to the United States the Sunday law of 2014? We're going to come back to explain why that is not an honest-hearted question. But we'll begin with one that has been asked by many people, and I think is a good, reasonable question to ask. So when we look at this pattern, this is an omega structure. It applies for the end of ancient Israel and for the end of modern Israel. 2 calls for the church, 1 call for the world or the Gentiles. So we're going to use both histories, end of ancient and end of modern, when we're writing on these lines. What do we call these 3 lines? What's our word for these 3? Looking for answers. What would you call this? Fractals. Good participation. So we call these lines fractals. What is the definition of a fractal? I'll give a visual representation. It's a structure, if I can try and simplify something that goes over my head easily. You have this pattern. It looks like a Y shape. If you take away that view, this becomes a fractal of this. Can everyone see that? So you have a pattern, and then you have a repeat of that pattern, and you can do it both sides. So we started with one pattern, then we created another, and then we created another, and they all become repetitive patterns, and you can continue to do this. And this becomes a fractal tree. So we started with 1, then we created, run out of hands, that, but now we can see that there's just this. This little structure is a fractal of our large one. Can we see that? And you could zoom in, and you could continue to create smaller and smaller fractals. And you can do that to all the branches. So it's this pattern where the smaller has the characteristics of the larger. Brother Brendan, amplification that repeats the same structure. Correct. That's a nice brief way of explaining a fractal. So is everyone okay with that? You could call this one, the one we began with, the line of the 144,000. And then you could say priests, Levites, Nethinims. Does that make sense? A large template model, and then you have these three smaller models on top of that. So, question. When we come to our reform line, end of ancient Israel, this top line, where is the cross? What history? That line of the 144,000. There is no cross. It's because I haven't drawn a way markup. History of the early rain, someone says. Concord in the second dispensation. See, I tricked you, Brother Blessing, because I didn't, Sister Charity. We didn't have these in. Apologies. Now where is the cross? Someone said early rain. So early rain is this history. What's this waymark? End of ancient Israel. "34. Gospel goes to the Gentiles. The work is done for the church, for the Jewish nation. This is the second call to the church that begins here. The second harvest of the Jewish nation. So this waymark is Pentecost. And this waymark is the cross. Does that make sense? So this is where the cross is on the line of the 144,000, the big template line for the end of ancient Israel. Where is the cross for the first group called? The disciples. Where does the cross go? Fractalize it. Someone says fourth waymark, close of probation, close of probation. What's the problem with what you just did? What's the issue? Sister Adriana says that's not a fractal. I agree. Where would you place it if you're going to fractalize that history? People are still saying 2019. Early rain. What's the year? We're taking this model and we're going to fractalize it. The early rain that begins in 2001, what's this waymark? 2009. Can you see what we just did? We took the large model, which would take you from 4 BC to 100 AD, and we created a fractal of it. If you create a fractal of this line, you take the cross from the Concord waymark of the early rain and bring it to the Concord waymark of the early rain. Does that make sense? So what I want to suggest is we need to be specific about what we mean when we say that these lines are fractals. If you look up fractals, it goes into complex mathematics, which is it can be a challenge. But they list 3 different types of fractals. I won't really, I'll just, they list 3 different types. I will just particularly show that there's 2 varieties. The first type of fractal is called exact self-similar. That's what we have here. That's generally the pictures that you would have seen. If you would Google the picture of a fractal, it'll show you something like that. And it's an exact self-similar fractal. So this is exactly what this is, which is exactly what this is. An exact self-similar fractal. But there are very few exact self-similar fractals in nature. What is much more common is a quasi-self-similar. So you have exact and you have quasi. The third type is called statistical self-similar. And I don't want to go into the difference between quasi and statistical. But what you have is you have fractals that are exact and fractals that are not exact. Quasi means partly. So it's partly a fractal. It's like a fractal hybrid. You have exact fractals, which tends to be shown in drawings, in pictures that demonstrate fractals, but you have what is much more common is a quasi-fractal, which is a mixture. Could you spell the second fractal, please? I'm sorry, it's hard to read on the board. It's a Q-U-A-S-I. That was private. A quasi-self-similarity. So without needing to be technical, it really just means that you have fractals that are exact and you have fractals that are a hybrid but still considered a fractal. What we have in reform lines is not exact fractals, and we will save ourselves a lot of trouble if we come to terms with that fact. We're dealing with fractal hybrids, partial fractals. The reason that we have that is because of how we are using that history. If we were to fractalize the cross, I'll rub this out because it's hard to read on Zoom anyway. If we were to fractalize the cross, we would take it from this line and we would see the cross here. Then we're going to place the cross here for the Levites, and then we'll place the cross here for the Nethinims. Does that make sense? That would be to take this history and to fractalize it. If we were to see the end of ancient Israel as one long history, what we would essentially be doing is cutting it up to fit it into these models. We would take it and we would squish it together, which is what we've done here. Take the whole fractal and you're just going to squish it down till you can make the cross fit over 2009, or you're going to stretch it and you're going to make it a smaller event fit on a larger model. You're going to manipulate that history. And this is the difference between our methodology and FFA's methodology. They are fine with stretching, squishing, cutting up history until it fits on the dispensation that they wish it to, and we don't do that. Someone asked, do we have to hold these 2 concepts at the same time? The cross being 2019 and 2009. And I would suggest no. When we make the cross 2009, I would suggest that is wrong methodology, and you have to manipulate the history to do that. What we have to do is be comfortable and familiar that when we use fractals, we're taking a whole expansive history from 4 BC to 100 AD, and we're just dropping that in. So we're seeing disciples, Levites, Gentiles, John as 144,000, and we're not manipulating the history. You can go and create another whole reform line about Christ as a disciple, but that becomes another reform line. It doesn't become a manipulation of this line. Does that make sense? Do we have any questions or anything on that? If you can please write if you do. What FFA would repeatedly do that we were battling against was manipulate that history. And you could do that if you believed in that exact definition of fractals, which would make the cross not 2019, but 2009. And then you would have to go back to 2009. I haven't written any, I won't go any lower, Mrs. Bennett, I promise. I promised my sister. You would have to go back to 2009 and try and force the cross onto that waymark. And then you're going to have to try and see what happened in 2009. What great disappointment did the movement face? What great crisis and test? What split occurred in 2009? How are we confronted with the crisis over the nature of the kingdom, that challenge, and you're not going to find it? And you would start manipulating not just their reform line to bring 2009 to here, but you're going to have to start going back and reinventing our own history to try and see why the cross would be fulfilled in 2009. And it just frankly isn't, because the cross is 2019. What I mean when I say it's a manipulation, to bring the cross from here to here, you have to take that history and you have to manipulate it, which I just mean to mean you have to try and cut it up or condense it down. It's 4 BC to 100 AD, and then it's understanding that this is just one part of that history in sequential order. So you have the disciples, first group for the Jews, then you're going to see second group for the Jews, then you're going to see Gentiles called in, and then you're going to see the 144,000 typified by John the Revelator. So we are not manipulating that history. We're not cutting it up. Does that make sense? What is fractalized is the structure. Do we see any disappointment in 2019? I would suggest that we do, but there are two types of disappointments. The disappointment of the disciples and Christ was not the same disappointment as that of the Millerites and Samuel Snow. So the disappointment of Christ and the disciples, Christ is disappointed. He's seeing the disciples that couldn't stay awake to pray for him. He's seeing that scattering, but it's no surprise. It's painful, but it's not a surprise. It's disappointing, but not a surprise. There was no mistake in his message. The disappointment of the Millerites and Samuel Snow was different because there was a mistake in their message. So it's two types of disappointments. We have that in 2019. We're disappointed by the shaking and the split, though it really shouldn't have been a surprise. We're disappointed by the fact that we didn't understand November 9. Also shouldn't be a surprise because we have reform lines that tell us we wouldn't at the time. So it is disappointing, but none of that indicates a mistake in the message, because there wasn't in the end of ancient Israel. So to answer a question, yes, the cross falls on 2019. It cannot be put on 2009, which is there, or 2016 or 2020. It's 2019.